It's time for proportional representation because both Labour and the Conservatives have become dysfunctional families and both wings of each party, well, it's time for them to go their own separate ways.
Jog on.
Now, I realise that's quite the statement, but it is something that I want to throw out there for people to debate and to discuss. For example, if Labour just didn't exist and it was going to be founded tomorrow, would, realistically, Jeremy Corbyn and Peter Mandelson sit down with each other and go, hey, do you fancy starting a party together? And equally, if they had the choice, would David Cameron and David Davis shake on it, say, let's found a party, both of us united together? I'm not convinced. The reason both Labour and the Conservatives are welded together is because of our electoral system, first past the post. Now, they've always been broad coalitions, but I wonder now if things have moved on, because first past the post was designed for a country in which people voted overwhelmingly for either Labour or the Conservatives. In the 1950s, nearly everybody either opted for one or the other. Clearly that's not the case. So you've had the rise of the Scottish National Party, the rise of UKIP, the rise of Plaid Cymru in Wales, the rise of the Greens, certainly from where they used to be. At the same time, within both the Conservatives and Labour, the coalitions that make them both up have become ever more fragmented and fractured. And I think that represents what's happened to British society. Society has become far more fragmented, far more complicated than it used to be. There are far more different kind of outlooks and views and interests that people have than when you used to have, you know, a very large, cohesive, for example, industrial working class. It's been said about the Labour Party, though I think it could be said about the Conservative Party, currently in the midst of ripping itself to shreds during the referendum, that Labour's become an unhappy marriage, where both partners now sleep in separate beds, where, you know, they're passive-aggressive, they're leaving notes on the fridge, slagging each other off, they basically hate each other. But they can't afford separate flats, so they're forced to stay together. And the reason for that is under our electoral system, if one wing of the party were to leave, as the right of the party did in the 1980s, the Social Democratic Party, unless you can concentrate your support in lots of different constituencies, then you get punished by the electoral system. You win barely any seats. So take UKIP. Now, I am no fan of UKIP, quite clearly, I think that's self-explanatory. But in the last general election, they won nearly 4 million votes across this country. How many MPs did they win out of 650? One. Now, we've seen fragmentation on the right. In terms of UKIP, arguably, are, if you like, a part what could have been traditionally of the Conservative coalition, including working class Conservatives, and they've migrated out the party, whilst at the same time a wing of the Conservative parties have become increasingly restless with what they see as a socially liberal, metropolitan and pro-European wing of the party. With the Labour Party, of course, you now have a situation where you have a Labour Party leadership and a Labour Party membership which are politically very, very different from much of the parliamentary Labour Party. And that is why, increasingly, on both left and right of the Labour Party, MPs are increasingly talking in support of proportional representation, because they think it doesn't make any sense for people to be in the same party, pretending that they're, you know, one and the same and united, when their outlooks are so different. So one MP on the right of the party put it to me like this, that if you had proportional representation, then the Labour Party automatically would end up splitting. You would have a kind of centre-left Social Democratic Party and then a party more rooted on the left. And that's exactly what happens in other countries where the electoral system allows, if you like, for parties to compete with each other without the fear that if you vote for a party closer to your conscience, you'll end up letting in a party which is even further away from what you actually believe. Now, take Spain at the moment, which is in the throes of a general election. Now, I don't know how that election is going to pan out. The polls, though, at the moment suggest that Spain could end up with a left-wing coalition. And that would be a coalition made up of PSOE, which is the Spanish equivalent of the Labour Party, a social democratic party, and then an alliance led by Podemos, a party only founded 2 years ago, which has a more left-wing bent. So what can happen then is you end up with a left-of-centre majority in the Spanish Parliament, and what happens is the left-of-centre parties get together on the basis of how many seats they won, compromise with each other and form a coalition. So instead of PSOE and Podemos being in the same party, fighting with each other and wrangling over, kind of who's in charge of the party and whatever else, they stand separately on their own platforms. You have a general election and then they can come together. Now, this MP on the right of the party suggested that that is a template for what could happen here, because effectively what's happened to the Labour Party is our PSOE and Podemos parties have been welded together artificially. This is a phenomenon that I've discussed many times that's happening not just in Britain and Spain, but across the Western world. So you see it in the United States, of course. Bernie Sanders, a self-described socialist, has won, more support than any socialist in American history. But he's standing against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. Now, they represent two very stark competing philosophies. Equally, in Greece, you had the older Social Democratic Party, PASOK, but then you've got the newer party, Syriza, and they could stand separately in general elections, and eventually Syriza ended up displacing PASOK. One problem with Labour at the moment, as one MP on the right of the party put it to me, is it's not simply that there are members of Parliament, Labour MPs, who think that Labour is unelectable under Jeremy Corbyn. It's that they wouldn't want him to be elected. In fact, they would be horrified at the prospect of a government coming to power with a set of policies that they just don't agree with at all. In fact, in some ways, they disagree with as profoundly as they would with the Conservatives. But they're in a dishonest position where they're forced to pretend otherwise, and you'll end up in a general election campaign where they'd end up sabotaging such a prospect. Now, Tony Blair, who is shamelessly parading his views at the moment on national television, I think given A, the calamity of the Iraq war, and B, the fact he's provided paid service to the tune of millions of pounds to various pretty brutal dictators, I think maybe pipe down a bit, Tony, but nonetheless, it was put to him about Jeremy Corbyn, and he talked about how
it would be a very dangerous experiment for a major Western country to get gripped by this type of populist policymaking, left or right.
Now, he's obviously talking about Jeremy Corbyn, that's what he's asked about, though he later denied it. During the Labour leadership debate, when he was asked at a Progress conference, he said it's not simply that he regarded Jeremy Corbyn as unelectable.
Even if I thought it was the route to victory, I wouldn't take it.
I voted against AV in 2011. That angers people sometimes when I mention it, but I've gone on a journey. I mean, take the Conservatives. Yeah, they won the last election, but the Conservatives won with the smallest share of the vote of any majority Conservative government in the history of British democracy.
And I will now form a majority Conservative government.
So when I'm berated for changing my mind, I would simply point out to people that unless other people also change their mind, then we won't end up, of course, with electoral reform and proportional representation. There are some Conservatives who've come round to that view. One of them I've interviewed, Daniel Hannan, a member of course, of the European Parliament. And it'll be interesting to see, as the divisions of the Conservative Party, how they play out, and I don't know yet. Maybe if they think that being forced to be in the same party as others, if you like, of very different views, becomes untenable. Tim Montgomery, a Conservative commentator, who used to be Ian Duncan Smith's Chief of Staff, he resigned from the Conservative Party a few months ago. Tim Montgomery actually did this quite interesting graphic for the Times, suggesting new parties that could be formed, and for him, he would join something called the National Party if you've got a realignment of British politics. Now, such a realignment could only be possible, of course, with proportional representation. So I want to hear what you think. Do you think actually maybe this is wrong, that eventually both parties, Conservatives, Labour, will resolve their differences, that they'll end up one big happy family, or they'll just manage their differences? Or do you think that given the fragmentation we've seen in British society, as reflected in politics, it's time now, in the next few years, to fight for a different system? I want to hear what you think, so do leave your comments, as ever. Love reading your comments, most of them. Let people know, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.